Welcome back! The objective in this chapter is to implement the first leg of the authorization code grant type that I talked about in the previous chapter. But it is quite a daunting process, so I've given a full chapter for each of the legs. We'll take it nice and slowly, and you can have a good drink after every leg. If you haven't watched the previous chapter, then please do so, but don't worry if you've watched the chapter and you don't remember all of the fine details. As long as you have a good idea of what the authorization code grant type is, then you'll be fine. And remember, we are kind of working twice as hard as we would normally have to work in the real world. We're going to be working on both the client, MailMonkey, and the provider of CRM system. And I guess in the real world, you would usually just be working on one of them. But really, everything that we described in the OAuth process, you could implement all of this by hand. You could use regular Spring MVC to set up a URL called authorize on the CRM system. You could take those parameters and store them away. You could use regular Spring Security to do the authentication steps. And here in leg 2, you could implement Spring MVC controller for the URI of token. And if these two fields authenticate, then you could generate a token and store it away in maybe a database and so on. But that sounds like a lot of work. But I hope you accept the point that it is possible to do all of it by hand. There's no special magic. However, because it would be a lot of hard work to do it by hand, we are lucky in that there is a side project to Spring. It's one of those additional projects. It's not part of Spring Security. It's considered an addition to Spring Security, and it's called Spring Security OAuth. As it says here, it provides support for using Spring Security with OAuth1. 1A was just an addition to the specification, and OAuth2. And that is exactly what we're going to be using on this course. Right from the start of this course, and this is another reason why I wanted you to use the code that I've given you for this course, we have actually had the one jar file. It's only one jar file, this project. If I'm in the CRM system here, in the lib folder, there is the Spring Security OAuth2 jar file. And I've also added that to the MailMonkey client as well. If you're using Maven, then the Maven dependencies are here on the OAuth project page. And the important thing is that there is in fact two separate jar files, one for OAuth1 and one for OAuth2. Remember, they are very different. You will need to make sure you've got the right one. Now, there is a problem with Spring Security OAuth, and now I don't intend this to be a criticism of the Spring OAuth team, but I think it's fair to say, if we follow the link here to the reference, I think it's fair to say that the reference information is quite sparse. There is a developer's guide, if I follow the link here, and we will need the OAuth2 developer's guide. This is pretty much one page of HTML. Okay, it's quite a long page, but I think if you were just working from this guide, it would be quite a challenge to actually get things up and running. They seem a lot of previous knowledge of the inner workings of Spring Security, and they certainly expect you to be an experienced OAuth expert. And in addition to that, if I can find the API Java docs, unfortunately, many of the classes in here, and I'll pick the OAuth2 REST template, which we're going to be covering in a lot of detail. I have to say that there isn't a lot of information here. It's pretty much a list of methods, and you'll probably find that most of the classes have even less information in than this. I don't intend that to be a criticism of the OAuth team. They've done fantastic work in building this library, and it's certainly a lot easier to use it than to do everything by hand. And the guys behind this have a lot of other projects to work on as well. They also provide what they call a tutorial here. And it isn't really a tutorial, it's more a sample application. And they have a setup very similar to the one that we have on this course. They have two separate web services which are interacting with each other. And that's great. The problem I find with that is because it's a pre-written application, I'm very bad at looking at existing code because I can't really see by looking at the code what's important for OAuth and what is irrelevant. Obviously, feel free to check out the sample application, but I think I would recommend you look at that once you've gone through this course. Obviously, we're going to be building everything from scratch. So by the end of that process, you should be able to read and understand their code far more easily. One big difference between what they've done and what we're doing is that at the time of this recording, they used Java configuration for all of the configuration. They stopped using the XML about a year ago. And well, that's fine. And I understand that Java configuration is far more popular these days than it used to be. Personally, I find the XML far easier to read because it keeps the configuration away from the Java code. But I realize that's a very controversial battleground in the Spring industry at the moment. But I will keep this reference manual open. We might want to look at it as we work through our code. So where do we start? Well, the obvious place to start is with our sequence diagram from the previous chapter. And you might remember from that we'll assume that our user has already logged on to the MailMonkey client application. And to start the whole process, we need somehow to send a GET request to the what's called the authorization endpoint. And that just means a URI that we've set up, which is able to initiate the OAuth process. Well, I can tell you in advance that the Spring OAuth default, and we definitely want to go with defaults where possible, the URI is going to be /authorize. And I mentioned that we need to send two parameters. That's going to be the client ID. Well, we know what that is. That's going to be MailMonkey. And I think we'll use lowercase m's, but that doesn't really matter. And we also need to send the redirect URI. Now, that's the page that we want to kick off the second leg. So that can be any URI of our choosing. Now, we need to make this GET request to the CRM system. And I guess we could do that using some kind of REST request, but it's far easier, really. We don't need the MailMonkey client application to be making that GET request. We can make that GET request from here in the browser. So my plan is we're just going to write a simple form which has these parameters built in, and that will get us started. Now that sounds quite easy. So we're working in MailMonkey to start with. And throughout the whole of this process, we always have to be clear which of the projects we're working in. And I suggest what we do is we go into the web folder, and the file called newsletter.jsp is the page that you've been seeing through this course, where we just have this coming soon. You're going to be able to import contacts from CRM. My plan is what we'll do is we'll just put a form together. Really, I hope you're following along with me. This is supposed to be virtual pair programming. I'd hate you just to go to the sample code for the course. You really need to see how this is all put together. And so the action then is going to be that authorization endpoint. We haven't set that endpoint up yet. It will need to be on the CRM system. But we know from the caption, we know from the sequence diagram that it's going to be localhost 8080. Of course, in real life, that will be a proper domain name, but it's going to be the CRM /. Now, here's the first slight difference to what we had on the caption. Actually, with Spring OAuth, the default authorization URI is OAuth/authorize. So I didn't quite have that on the caption. There is an OAuth in front. Now do be careful with the spellings here. I'm always misspelling OAuth, and authorize has a Z or a Z rather than an S. We are going to be sending 4 parameters to this URI. Now I know I only had 2 on the caption. I think I had the client ID and the redirect URI, but I'm going to add in a further 2 parameters. I'm not making these parameters up. These parameters are defined in the standard. Now, often on courses, I try to hide these specifications and standards because they're never much fun to read. But I think in the case of OAuth, it's well worth getting yourself acquainted with the spec. You'll find it at the URL you can see here. It's actually RFC 6749. I guess you're familiar with RFCs. That's the kind of informal standards of the request for comments that forms the basis of a lot of the internet. And all right, there's a lot of stuff in there, but in section 4.1, there's the details of how the authorization code grant works. Now that's what we're working on. If we follow the link to 4.1, there is a cute little diagram here, which I think you'll find is pretty much what we've been doing on our sequence diagrams. They're probably a little bit more accurate than I was, and they've got a couple of things in there that we haven't yet covered. But if I go further down, this is the important bit. 4.1.1 is telling us how to make this authorization request. And that is actually what we are doing right now. And it's telling us that we need to use the application x form URL encoded format. Well, we're going to get that because we're using a form. And it's telling us there are 5 possible parameters we can send here. We know about the client ID, and that's required. And we know about the redirect URI. I'll be telling you in a later chapter why that's optional, but we are going to need it. The other parameter we will need is the response type parameter. Now this is required, and it says the value must be set to code. Well, if it must be set to that, why do we have the parameter? Well, that's what we would use to indicate if we were using one of the different grant types. We're using the authorization code grant type, and that's what that means. So I hope that's easy. We're also going to have this scope parameter. I'll be talking in a lot more detail in a later chapter about how scopes work. But for now, I just want you to think of that as we are specifying whether we want read or write access to the data. For now, we're going to be starting with read-only access, so we will have a value of read for the scope. So now we know what the parameters need to be. This is going to be a simple case of adding them as inputs. Now I know this is going to be very odd. When we finish doing all of this work, we're going to tidy this up and make all of this completely hidden to the end user. But because we're developing, and I'd like to see as much of this process as possible, I'm going to make these regular input boxes. Input type equals text. So for the first one, we had the response type field, and that's the one that must be set to the value of code. Now, of course, I could have made this a hidden field, but I want to see it on the UI, at least at first. And so we would carry on. Our next field is going to be the client underscore ID, and the value for this is going to be male monkey. And then we need to add the redirect underscore URI. It's not URL, it's URI. It is I for India. And the value of this, well, we don't really know yet, but remember I said this is going to be the landing page. It's going to be the page that the end user is sent back to for legs 2 and 3. So I think we can hazard a guess at what this might be. It's going to look something like localhost 8080. This will be the MailMonkey site. And, well, I guess we can call it anything we like, really. I think on the caption, I called it import. So I think to be consistent, I will do exactly the same. We could put an extension on there. I think I will. Import.html. And the final parameter was the name of scope. And we'll set the value of that to read. The details of that are going to form a full chapter later in the course. Then we will need a submit button. So we'll do input type equals submit. I think it would be useful to add a label in here. So this is going to be the response type. And we'll wrap this in paragraph tags. So this one is the client ID. This is the redirect URI. So I'm not expecting the user to change any of these fields, but it will be nice to see the values on screen. So hopefully nothing too groundbreaking there. Let's rerun the build and just make sure that that renders okay. And just to remind you, you will want to double check that the deployment really has happened. And there it goes. So you will want to visit the URL now, mailmonkey/buildnewsletter.html. We will be forced to log in. And now we have our form with hopefully the correct values in there. Now we haven't done the work of implementing the authorization endpoint. So if we click submit, well, we are being sent to the CRM site, but only because we've been intercepted for a login. If we now do the login, and remember the username and password for this site is different, yeah, we're getting a 404, simply because our authorization endpoint needs to be implemented. So it looks like that's the next big job. Well, as I said, you could, if you wanted to, implement all of this by hand. You could write a controller and map it to the URL of /auth/authorize, and you could take it from there. But this is why we're using the Spring OAuth project. A lot of that will be achieved with small amounts of configuration. And the XML that you can see on screen right now is enough to have a pre-built authorization server mapped to the correct URI, and it has a lot of built-in features. So we're using here for the first time the OAuth namespace. I haven't told you that a lot of the configuration of Spring OAuth is simplified using a namespace. I'm sure you're familiar with doing that from other parts of Spring, including Spring Security, of course. Just before I go into the details of this, if you find your CRM securityconfig.xml file, before I started recording the course, I've already included the namespace declaration here and the schema location here. So we can just use OAuth2 in our tags. And that's exactly what I'm doing here. And by using the authorization server tag, this will automatically configure a controller mapped to the correct URI. This, by the way, is where you could change the URI if you wanted it to be something different, but I really want to stick with the defaults where possible. We need one parameter, and this is a reference to a bean called client details service. I'll come on to that in a few moments. But there is an embedded tag inside here, and you can see that this is the authorization code tag. It's an odd way of doing it, but what we're doing here is we're telling Spring OAuth that we want to support the authorization code grant type for this system. If we wanted to support any of the other grant types that's coming up later on in the course, then we would add further tags here. But that's all we need for this chapter on authorization code. One thing to note is that you must secure the URL for this authorization endpoint. If you don't secure that URL, then Well, you can probably see what's going to happen. If we go back to the flow of leg 1, of course, what we want when this URL is accessed is we want the user to be challenged with a login dialog box. Without that, we will miss one of the important parts of this flow, and that is the user has to authenticate. So we're going to make sure that we do put security on that endpoint. This block of XML will also set up the token endpoint. That's what we use in leg 2, so we won't worry about that right now, but we will come back to it. Okay, well, the one thing we're missing in our configuration is this client details service that we're referring to. What's that all about? Well, the client details service is an object in our configuration which is going to be responsible for storing the list of registered clients. If you want, you can think of this as a direct equivalent to the authentication provider that we've been using in standard Spring Security. Remember that that is responsible for storing a database of usernames, passwords, and authorities. Of course, we're using an in-memory version here, but as on the previous module, you could use a database implementation to store them in a table, and you probably would in real life. This client details service is pretty much the same thing. The only reason that there is a special bean to do this rather than the pre-existing bean is that you've seen that the clients have slightly different requirements. For instance, it's not a username, it's a client ID, and it's not a password, it's a secret. But we've also got, for a client, we also need to track for any given client what grant types are they allowed to use. We'll be going into a lot more detail on that later on, but it might be that MailMonkey is only allowed to use the authorization code grant type because that's secure and that's what we want. But for some other clients, we might allow them to use a slightly less secure grant type. More on that later, but for us, MailMonkey will be authorization code. Oh, and a client also has a scope that they are allowed to work with. I'm kind of going to ignore scope for a while, but you've seen it already. We're going to allow MailMonkey to read the data. Also, and this will come in useful later on in the flow, we can give a client an authority, and that's just the same types of authority that we've been working with in standard Spring Security. I've taken the decision that it would be wise to have a special role just for these application clients. That way I'll be able to keep the clients separate from the real human users. So what we're doing here then is we're hard coding the client into the configuration. We're using an in-memory client details service, and that's all happening for free via this OAuth2 client tag. However, exactly as in standard Spring Security, it is fine to plug in an implementation of the JDBC client details service, which is going to work with a database table, of course. Now, I'm probably not going to use a database for any of this course because it would just slow us down even further. But I hope you can see, using your standard Spring configuration, it would be a trivial job to switch out this block of configuration and to plug in a JDBC implementation instead. So let's get this configuration in. And once again, I hope you're following along here. There is going to be a lot of XML coming up. There's no easy way of saying that. So I think we ought to be very careful with our comments. This is setting up for the authorization and token endpoints. So that's /OAuth/authorize and /OAuth/token. If you've got the proper XML editor, you will get some kind of IntelliSense here, and we're looking for the authorization server tag. There are a lot of supported parameters here, but to get us started, the only one we need is the client details service ref. We haven't created that bean yet, but I will call that client details service. Inside here, there is only one tag. These are all of the other grant types that are supported by Spring OAuth. More information later. We want authorization code, and I think, well, there are a couple of parameters in there, but they're not required parameters. So that's step one. Step two, we're going to define our OAuth client details service. So the ID for this bean will be exactly what we had there. And then only one tag in here, OAuth clients. The client ID is going to be MailMonkey. Of course, we can define these. We have authorized grant types. The IntelliSense doesn't seem to be helping there, but I told you on the caption that we need authorization code for this client at least. The authorities for this client is going to be the role of client. Now, that's a role that I've just made up. I haven't referenced that anywhere just yet. We'll come on to that later. The scope they're going to have is read, and again, more details on that one later. And the secret is going to be some kind of secret key. And I did say this in the previous chapter, but the values that we have here, you will probably have some kind of client registration page. You would inject this client details service into that registration page and register them programmatically. So that's a start. I'm going to run the build. We've made a big change, so check your console very carefully. I would guess the most common form of errors here are going to be XML errors. It looks like I've gone through okay, but if you see any kind of XML-based error, you've probably missed a closing tag or something like that. I think before we run this, it's worth reviewing the full flow of leg one. You're probably sick of seeing this picture by now, but it's probably worthwhile. So we've done this part. We've been able to send a request to the authorization URI. Up until now, that's not been available, but it should be now. We've seen that the CRM system has responded with a login prompt, so the user can specify their username and password. It was at this point we got the 404 before, but what we would like to see now is a page sent back to the user saying the application MailMonkey wants to read your customers yes or no. So that's the next step that we're going to need to implement. That sounds like quite hard work. And the final steps in leg one is the user will say yes or no. And if they say yes, we want the redirect to be sent back so that we continue leg two on the MailMonkey site. Now that we've deployed, let's see what happens if we run the process again. So we need to go back to the build-newsletter.html page, for which we need to log in. None of these need changing. Now if we press submit, well, that's good. We're getting the login challenge. I don't remember making any special effort to secure the authorization endpoint. So we need to remember to go back to that. But hold your breath now. If we now log into the CRM system, you should find, and I hope you agree this is quite wonderful, we've automatically, with absolutely no work required, got the next step of the process. OAuth approval. Do you authorize MailMonkey to access your protected resources? And we can authorize or deny. Now, okay, I admit this looks ugly. It's designed to be ugly, really. They call this the white label implementation of this step. It's intended that we replace this with our own far nicer looking page, and we will do that later on. But it's great that we can forget about this step at this stage. If we press deny, then we're getting a 404 page, and that's purely because we haven't yet defined an error page. We do have to do that work ourselves. That doesn't really matter. If I run through the process again, I don't have a bookmark for buildnewsletter.html, so let's run through that again. Now notice this time I didn't have to log in, and that's because of course my login has been remembered on the CRM system. It's part of my session with the CRM system, and that login will be remembered until I redeploy the application. This time, if I click on authorize, well, 404, are you disappointed? Well, you shouldn't be. Check the URL bar here. I hope you can see now that the browser has indeed attempted to request the URI of /mailmonkey/import.html with an authorization code. This is exactly what we wanted on this final step. And in fact, what we've really got here is the first step of leg 2, a GET request to the import page. Just before we move on to leg 2, I want to remind you that it's critically important that the URI for the authorize endpoint absolutely must be secured. Otherwise, the user won't get a chance to authenticate themselves. Well, it looks like we've been getting that for free, and indeed we have. And it's really just as a result of the fact that we have, for the, I've called it the vanilla website settings, we're intercepting all URIs except login and the CSS folder. And we're insisting on the role of CRM_user. But actually, I've just noticed, and this is just a slight mistake I've made, I've already given you an intercept URL beginning with OAuth. It's not really needed because it's going to be caught by that intercept URL anyway. I think this is a hangover from my rehearsals when I was setting all of this up, and I probably should have removed that. But I think I'm going to leave it in because it certainly makes good sense to have an explicit configuration for that particular set of endpoints. And then if we start reworking these later, we're not going to accidentally forget them. So that's why that's been working. We're now at the end of leg 1. You might want to take a bit of a break now. We've still got legs 2 and 3 to go.